In chapter 16, the book of Acts. We will be starting in verse 6. For those of you who are watching this on video, this will be a very short class today because of weather-related problems. Anyway, that's why it'll be cut short. So to catch us all up, Paul and company here are in the midst of their second missionary journey. And they traveled overland from Syria and Antioch to the churches that they had established on their first journey in the south of Turkey there. And this time with Silas instead of Barnabas because of a disagreement over John Mark. And they're carrying with them a letter composed by the leadership in Jerusalem that contains the decision regarding the issue of Gentiles needing to become proselytes in order to be in the club. And so while in Lystra, they pick up Timothy, a young man of good reputation, who will be featured in two of Paul's letters. And so, Candy, do you want to read 6 through 10, please?
Yes. And they passed through the
Phrygian.
The what?
Phrygian.
Phrygian and Galatian region, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. And when they had come to Mysia, they were trying to go into Bithynia, and the Spirit of Jesus did not permit them. And passing by Mysia, they came down to Troas, and a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A certain man of Macedonia was standing and appealing to him, and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." And when he had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go to Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them.
Now, to understand all this, it's a lot easier to see this on the map. Now, do you notice that we have a new map?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I found one in my pile of maps I didn't even know I had. So anyway, so this gives you a little bit bigger picture. But they're going to be in Syria and Antioch, which is right in this area right here. And when they get there, they have decisions to make. They have choices. Now there is a really good Roman military road that goes all the way through here and ends up on the coast in Ephesus. And it passes by or goes through towns like Laodicea, Colossae, Philadelphia. So that's where they wanted to go. But God says, "No, you're not going that way." And so they said, okay, plan B. So they went up north, and Bithynia is this area right up in here, okay, to the north here. And it's a province like Galatia and Asia and whatever. So they went up toward Bithynia, and they wanted to go up into this area because they probably wanted to get all the way up to Byzantium, which is right here, which was a real major city. And from there, they could have crossed the Bosphorus and gone into Asia that way. But God says, "No, you're not going that way either." And so they said, okay, plan C. And so they cut west, and they pass through Mysia, and they end up in Troas on the coast right here. Okay? And so they find themselves standing facing the Aegean Sea with their toes in the water, wondering what do we do now? And so then they have this. Paul gets this vision, and so. But does any of this sound familiar to you? Have you ever felt like you needed to go this way? And God says, "No, you're not going that way." And so you say, okay, well, maybe I need to go this way. God says, "No, you're not going that way either." And so you're thinking to yourself, "God, what in the world do you want me to do?" You know, does that happen to anybody?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Now, if you've been following the saga of Andy and Karina over the last year plus, this fits their life to a T. And
Yeah. You've
probably been there too. But about this Troas. Now, Troas was Alexandria Troas, and it was named for Alexander the Great. And it's about 10 miles south of the ancient city of Troy. And this site was near and dear to the Romans because they considered themselves descendants of the Trojans. Okay, now, while in Troas, Paul has this other vision, and being a vision, that he was awake even though it was night, and somehow he recognized this man as being from Macedonia. Now, feeling that they now had clear direction, they set sail from Macedonia, which was across the Aegean Sea into this area right up in here. It's all Greece. This area is Macedonia, right up here. Okay. All right. So now the port of Troas was the jump-off place for travelers who were bound for Macedonia. What a coincidence! So I want you to take a close look at verse 10. There are two words there that are quite significant. See if you can figure out what those words are.
Immediately.
Hmm?
She said immediately.
Good guess. Eh.
So what's the question again?
There's two words in that verse that are very significant. See if you can figure out what they are.
On call.
They're very small words.
Decided.
That's too big.
We got,
You're close. You got half of it.
Calling.
How about these two words?
We go.
We and us.
Okay, yeah.
Now, what do these words in a narrative indicate about the writer?
He joined them.
The writer is part of the narrative. So if the writer is Luke, he has now joined the group in Troas. And he's going to stay with the group until Philippi. But he's going to remain in Philippi for a time, and then he's going to rejoin the troop later on. This makes Luke an eyewitness to many of the events in the last half of this book. Okay? All right, Karen, could you read 11 through 12?
from Troas we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace, and the next day we went on to Neapolis. From there we traveled to Philippi, the Roman colony and the leading city of that district of Macedonia, and we stayed on there for several days.
After setting sail, they spend one night on the island of Samothrace, which is about halfway across, and then they land in Macedonia at the port of Neapolis. And from there, it's about 10 miles to Philippi on a famous Roman road called the Ignatian Way. Mm-hmm. And this road is actually the main route through this part of Greece, and it ended up, in fact, this is the road right here. Ended up in Greece, all the way across into the Adriatic Sea, and then from there by ship to Rome. Okay, now the road actually starts in Byzantium here. Okay, so it is the main road that connected Rome to Asia. Right, very important road. So Luke is going to devote the rest of this chapter to events in Philippi, and some neat things are going to happen here. Now, you might remember Macedonia had at one time been a very powerful empire. This is the land of Alexander the Great. This was his home. Okay? Now, Philippi was declared a Roman city by Caesar Augustus for the purpose of making a home for military veterans. And it was thereby establishing a Roman presence in that very strategic area there. Now, one historically interesting thing that happened in Philippi is the defeat of Brutus and Cassius. Those were two of the murderers of Julius Caesar. And they were defeated by Octavian, who was later called Caesar Augustus. Now, you need to understand what had just happened when Paul and his company travel from Troas to Macedonia. They just sailed from Asia to Europe, from east to west, from Eastern thinking to Western thinking. And that's probably going to play some roles here later on, right? Okay, where are we? Let's see, Nancy, could you read 13 through 15?
Sure. On the Sabbath, we went a little way outside the city to a riverbank where we thought people would be meeting for prayer, and we sat down to speak with some women who had gathered there. One of them was Lydia from Thyatira, a merchant of expensive purple cloth, who worshipped God. As she listened to us, the Lord opened her heart, and she accepted what Peter was saying. She and her household were baptized, and she asked us to be her guests. If you agree that I am a true believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my home. And she urged us until we agreed.
Okay. So some believe that there was no synagogue in Philippi, but there were some Jews and proselytes living there at the time anyway. And there must have been a known place outside the city near a river where they typically met for prayer and or worship on the Sabbath. And being by a river, it would have been a good place because of the need for water in the ritual washings. But the Greek word for prayer can also mean house of prayer, and that is a synagogue. And so there could have been one, but regardless of that, the group settles in and they strike up this conversation with a group of women. And the implication is that these women had come to the riverside to worship. And it doesn't say there were no men there, and it doesn't say that no men were talked to. But this literary device here that Luke uses, he uses it to introduce the one woman who becomes a believer. And so what do we learn about her? Well, she's from Thyatira, which is right about here. And it's from the province of Lydia, part of Asia, and Lydia also happens to be her name. But she has a business of selling purple cloth, and the dyeing of cloth in Thyatira was well known at the time. And you're probably aware that purple cloth was quite expensive. You're probably also aware that the dye comes from the small marine murex snail. And I've read that it took thousands of snails to yield a single thimbleful of dye.
Wow.
And so this accounts for its expense. But just FYI, there was a less expensive way to get purple dye from the root of a plant. And that method was one of the methods that was used in Thyatira at the time. So it could have been either, but women in Macedonia had more social power than those in other Greek areas, and it was not unusual for a woman to have a successful business like this one. And so she responds to Paul's message and becomes a believer as she gets baptized. And we aren't told who made up her household, but they were baptized as well. Right.
So was she a Jew then? If she was from...
Yeah, she was there worshiping.
Right.
So she could have either been a Jew or she could have been a proselyte. We don't know.
But she was from Asia, not from Europe.
She was from Asia. This is Asia right here.
Even though they met her in Europe.
Yes. Well, it's very likely, this is what commentators indicated, that this was a better place to sell purple than it was here. And so she was plying her trade over in this area. So I don't know if that's true or not, but some commentators have made that comment. Okay, where am I? So anyway, hospitality was a virtue in those days, and so she would have been honor bound to kind of put this company up for a time, and so the inns in those days were less than ideal places for Jews to stay, being notorious for prostitution, and there were other issues as well, like kosher foods, lots of alcohol, that kind of thing. So not a nice place for the Jews. So it probably didn't take too much convincing to get Paul and his company to bunk at her place. So as Paul and company are headed out to the river one day, they meet a slave girl. In the right place. We need to read a little bit. Jim, 16 through 18, please.
And it happened that as we were going to the place of prayer, a certain slave girl, having a spirit of divination, met us, who was bringing her master much profit by fortune telling. Following after Paul and us, she kept crying out, saying, "These men are bondservants of the Most High God, who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation." And she continued doing this for many days, but Paul was greatly annoyed and turned and said to the spirit, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her," and it came out at that very moment.
So as Paul and company are headed out to the river one day, they're met by this slave girl, and the language seems to indicate this meeting could have been intentional on her part, which makes me kind of wonder, could Satan have orchestrated all this? Now, it literally says here that she had the spirit of a python. And this comes from the Greek god Apollo's famous temple at Delphi. Now, I'm not real clear on how this story goes. Sarah, maybe you can help me out a little bit here. But to make a long story short, Apollo had slain a dragon or a serpent by the name of Python. And this dragon either continued to live in the ground underneath this temple or died and its rotting flesh or whatever smoke came up through the ground. You remember that story?
I remember the story, but I don't remember the details very well.
Okay, well, it's close enough. So, so anyway, they would send the smoke up through the ground that would make a female oracle go into a trance, and she would utter obscure messages that then had to be translated by the priest. And this was, of course, very pagan, and this slave girl's abilities came from a demonic spirit. Who gave the girl the ability to reveal secret information about people's lives and to supposedly reveal things about their futures. And so she was probably quite well known there, and she was sought after for her abilities. And her owners were most likely not Jews, because these were things that were forbidden for God's people, and although they could have been. And we've run into that before, and we're going to run into it again later on. And you'll find the first record of this prohibition in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 10, if you ever want to look that up. But we see this girl was a source of income for her owners. So she began to follow Paul and company around, and she would shout out things. And what she was saying was actually true. And this went on for several days. And this kind of gives us a little insight into one of Satan's strategies. He can even use truth in a way that inhibits the truth from being effective. Now, how did this irritate Paul? Well, one guess is that she was interfering with Paul's ability to present this message on his own terms. You see, he had a strategy for how he wanted to do things, and there was method in his madness, and she was interfering with all of this. Now, one commentator also suggested that Paul did not want anyone to think she was part of his ministry. Because, after all, she was using demonic power in her program, and Paul would not have wanted to have any part of that.
I think it's important to know where the source of the truth came from, because with her, she's clearly she's recognized in that community as somebody who's anchored in paganism, anchored in the demonic side. If the truth is revealed through her in a demonic state, the source of the truth had a very corrupted source.
Sure.
And it's like, if it comes through Paul, it comes through the gospel of revelation from God, it carries a different impact. Even though it is interesting, because it's like, what's being said is true.
Yeah.
That's exactly what's going on. So it's not the fact of what's being said; it's where it's coming from. It's
right.
like, and it makes a big difference.
Sure, and we don't know how she said it either, whether it was sarcastic, or what. Maybe it was in a mocking way too.
Oh, could be.
Yeah, another commentator actually suggested that her use of the term "Most High God" could have applied to Zeus in the minds of the people. And that would have left open the acceptance of a pantheon of gods there too. So anyway, Paul demands the demon to come out of her. And notice that he did not pray to God for the spirit to come out, but he directly addressed the demon. And this is consistent with the authority that Jesus himself had over the demons and the authority he had given his disciples. And here Paul invokes the name of Jesus to apply that authority. So anyway, we see the exorcism worked and the girl lost her abilities. And it was unusual really for anyone to exorcise a python spirit, because they were generally thought of as a useful and helpful spirit, not a bad one. Okay? So anyway, we'll see that this exorcism does not sit well with her owners. Okay,
That costs money.
Huh?
That costs money.
Yes, it does.
So I was
And
just
they're not happy.
noticing in verse 16 that she was at the place where they were worshiping.
Yes.
So the other story, that the demons want to be sent into the pigs.
Mhm.
So in this case, Jesus doesn't send, or excuse me, Paul doesn't send the demon anywhere else.
At least it's not recorded.
Okay.
He just said, come out, and the spirit left her. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Harvey, you want to read 19 through 24?
Sure. But when her masters saw that their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the authorities. And when they had brought them to the chief magistrates, they said, "These men are throwing our city into confusion, being Jews, and they are proclaiming customs which it is not lawful for us to accept or to observe, being Romans." And through verse 24.
Yes, please.
Okay. The crowd rose up together against them, and the chief magistrates tore the robes off them and proceeded to order them to be beaten with rods. When they had struck them with many blows, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to guard them securely. And having received such a command, threw them into the inner prison and fastened their feet with stocks.
Now, with good reason, the girls' owners are pretty upset over their loss of income, and there must have been several owners to be able to grab two grown men and drag them off to the marketplace. Because in that society, in order to bring a case against someone, you had to bring them before the magistrates.
Right.
Okay, so now here again we see the desire for profit up against the gospel.
Just like an emphasis.
Yeah, Simon in Samaria, and Elymas in Cyprus, here in Philippi, and we're going to see this again in chapter 19, silversmiths. But, profit isn't a bad thing. No profit, no economy, no food on the table. But if one's means of income flies in the face of the truth of the gospel, it might be time to find another career. So Paul and Silas find themselves standing before the magistrates, and there would have been two of them appointed by Rome in each colony. Now notice the charge leveled against them here. There is no mention of the exorcism of the demon or their financial loss. The charge was simply, these men are Jews, strike one, and they're causing trouble by advocating we break our laws, strike two. That's it. Now, they know they couldn't win the case on the grounds of property loss, and so they tried this one. And the charge was not without merit, because Roman law forbade the adoption of foreign cults. This is what the Roman law said. It says, no one shall have gods for himself, either new or foreign gods, unless they are officially recognized. Now that alone was enough to get him beaten. But it was still a severe miscarriage of justice even in those times. Now if Paul and Silas were not Jews, the charges likely would not have flown. But anti-Judaism was fashionable by then in some parts of the empire, and by this time, Claudius had expelled the Jews from Rome, and Philippi was a very Roman colony. So there was a definite bias in favor of Roman citizens here. And Paul in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, he says he was shamefully treated at Philippi. And so the magistrates ordered them beaten. And in Roman colonies, magistrates had attendants who followed them around with a bundle of sticks and as a display of their authority. And whenever they needed one, they would have one of them pull one of those sticks out and they would use it. So now they stripped off their clothing, and that was to further humiliate them. As for people from the East, including Jews, who were particularly modest people, this would have been especially humiliating. And as further punishment, they're put in the inner prison. And this was the darkest, most poorly ventilated, and most secure part of the prison, and most likely crowded.
Was that just for punishment, or is that for security? Because the jailer was afraid
Probably
this
both.
guy cannot get away,
Yeah,
so I'm gonna put him in the
probably
most maximum security cell or whatever.
Probably both, yeah. Now, this is not a bright, warm, clean, nice smelling place. And jailers were not the nice, friendly people. In fact, they were rewarded for their harshness. Now, besides this, their feet are put in the stocks, and this would make them sit in a very uncomfortable position, unable to move, and not even be able to use the facilities. So this is not just imprisonment, it's torture. And this is not going to be a pleasant night. Got a question, Harden?
So, but there's a problem with the beating, and that comes up later, and that is that Paul's a Roman citizen, and they were punished and beaten without due process,
Correct.
and that would come back, okay, you'll address that.
Yep. All right, so anyway, these punishments that they received were really usually reserved for those of low social status. And as Paul Harvey.
That's the rest of the story. That's the rest of the story.
But anyway, whoever that is, he said that this you don't do this on untried Roman citizens. It just was not done. In fact, it was against the law to do that. All right, Jan, you want to read 25 through 30?
About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly, there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once, all the prison doors flew open, and everybody's chains came loose. The jailer woke up, and when he saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, because he thought the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourself, we are all here." The jailer called for lights, rushed in, and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. He then brought them out and asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?"
So in the middle of the night, we find Paul and Silas are praying and serenading the other prisoners. And the jailer might have heard all of this as well, including the jailers, including maybe even the one in charge. And these hymns could have been some of the Old Testament psalms, but by this time, there were some new songs in honor and praise to Jesus. And so the other prisoners and the jailers could have heard some of those. And it is interesting that almost universally, commentators applaud Paul and Silas for having joy in the midst of their misery. But if one looks at these verses, it doesn't say anywhere that they were joyful. It just says they prayed and sang songs to God. There is no mention of joy. Now, I know my prayers in that situation would be to let God know I was completely miserable, and would you please get me out of here. So that could have been the case here too, I don't know, but I think the point is this: in their misery, they were not in despair. They knew who was in charge, and that they could still turn to him, and they did. And I think that's the lesson. And we can absolutely hate our own circumstances, but we still know who's in charge, and we know who we can turn to. So, a big earthquake, big enough to rock the prison and blow open doors and loosen chains, but the keeper saw the open doors and supposed that the prisoners had fled, and this must have put him in a pretty poor frame of mind, considering what the consequences were to be if any had escaped. And he knew the punishment would have been worse than falling on one's sword. And besides this form of suicide was considered to be an honorable death in that society. And being executed for one's failure in one's duty was not considered especially honorable. And besides this, the jailer knew if he was executed, all his property would be confiscated and his family would be left with nothing. So it was dark in the inner prison, so the jailer would not have known the prisoners were still there. But somehow Paul knew what the man was about to do. Maybe because Paul knew that's what he was expected to do. I don't know. So Paul yells at him not to do it. Now, I am guessing that due to the response of the jailer, The prisoners could have escaped,
Mhm.
but they didn't. And I think this man knew he had just cheated death. And this may very well have caused him to consider the consequences of his life in the afterlife. And to add to that, he may have heard him praying, singing, and maybe even some preaching to the other prisoners. We don't know. So he falls down before Paul and Silas in fear and asks the big question. Now, how's that for an open door to witness? This is every Christian's dream right here. Now, look at the simplicity of Paul's response. It says, believe in Jesus. And not only that, not only will you be saved, but anyone in your house can be saved also.
Mhm.
Now, notice the sequence of events here. The events here are a little bit confusing, but what for sure happened is that the jailer took Paul and Silas out of the prison. He introduced them to his household. They get preached to, and they believe, and Paul and Silas get their words tended to and get invited home to dinner. Yes, Karen?
Question. So, something I've always wondered about this verse 31 is how does that square with the 10 steps necessary for salvation?
A 10?
Well, there is a school of thought that I've been taught that there are 10 steps necessary for salvation, including sanctification and continuing and all of that. So here it says, you just need to believe and you are
That's
saved.
pretty simple. Well, here's the thing, okay? Now, I've offered this before, okay? And probably don't know if I can do it in the next few minutes. But it's an important thought here. And it's the difference between Eastern and Western thought. Okay, now in the West, we have a way of thinking where we tend to internalize concepts. Things like faith, things like trust, belief, those kinds of concepts are internal. Now, to an Eastern thinker, those concepts have both an internal component and an external component. Now, so if you say things like believe, if you things like have faith, and like trust, they have not only something going on in here, but there is an expected outcome from that. There's an expected result of what's in here. And the two things were not separate. They were all part of the same thing. So to an Eastern thinker, if you said that you have faith, it meant that that something happened as a result of that. There was a consequence, that there was an expected action based upon that faith. In the West, we don't have that. All those things are in here. And that's the difference. So when you read the Bible, you have to realize that Bible was entirely written by Eastern thinkers. Okay? So when they say things like that, you have to understand what they meant by what they said. We read it with Western minds, not Eastern minds. Okay? I don't know if that helps explain that, but yeah, Harvey.
I mean, one way I look at that would be the difference between belief, meaning I mentally assent to understanding and acknowledging that truth, as opposed to I am convicted by that truth and my actions are going to follow that.
Exactly.
Is that a
That is exactly what I'm trying to say. Yes. Yes. Okay. So when you talk about 10 steps, okay, we're looking at that as from an Eastern point of view, whereby somebody who has faith, somebody who believes, there is an expected outcome of that. Okay. Now, whether or not I don't know all the whole 10 steps. Okay. I'm not familiar with all of them, but I think that kind of a reflection of that. Whereas so many people here in the Western world say, I have faith, but that's it. It's just something that you have. It's not something that you do. And faith is not something you just have. Faith is also something you live. Okay? And that is the way an Eastern thinker the writers of the Bible would have looked at it that way.
And that kind of explanation makes sense of James too.
Right.
I remember having a conversation with somebody that, but I unfortunately ran into nice person who came to my door that said that they no longer were Christians because the church had lied to them. Lied to them in the sense that said, you are saved by faith alone. And when they read James, it says, you are not saved by faith alone. So therefore the church is, and obviously it's a misunderstanding.
Sure it
It is
is.
what it is.
Sure it
And
is.
so I remember sharing, it's like, well, you misunderstand what that's trying to say. And I ended up trying to go down that same path, but that was, because it implies so much more than
Sure.
what it is. And it seems like that's what James was getting at, is exactly what you're getting at, that he's trying to explain.
Yeah. Yeah, so, let's see, where are we?
I'd love to say the person that came to Christ. At least I got him thanking
Yeah.
Lord willing.
Well, just to get us back to where we finished reading here, somewhere in there, the jailer and all of his household get baptized. And why does Paul do that? It's because Jesus told his disciples to do it. It was the expected natural outcome for a new believer. New believers were baptized, period. That is what they did. At the end of verse 34, we're going to see the jailer and his household rejoiced in their newfound faith. And the word in the Greek there implies a deep spiritual joy. And that should be the natural reaction of one who had just come to Christ. Okay, so we'll wrap that up there, and we will start with verse 35 next time.
Wow.
Let's pray.